Citizens, for too long your questions have gone unanswered. For too long these new aristocrats mock your cries and concerns. Enough. The good sans-culottes will take no more. It is time to have your questions answered. It is time for the people's voice. Hello everybody and welcome to the brand new segment, The People's Voice. Henceforth, I will be regularly answering your queries from all over the Republic. No topic will be left untouched, and in this episode, we're going to be discussing a wide variety of fascinating subjects. To start with, we'll commence with what the convention knew of ancient Rome's attempts to fix prices as it drafted its own price maximums in 1793. We'll then turn our attention to the factors fueling the worsening food shortages which were prompting the creation of these laws. After that, we'll look for evidence that everyday citizens were using the terror to settle personal grievances and advance their own self-interests. And finally, we'll wrap up with the power of the high nobility in pre-revolutionary France. Along the way, we'll somehow discuss everything from avalanches to unscrupulous prisoner informants. So buckle up, as this will be a great deep dive into revolutionary France. Now, going forward, we'll be covering a wide variety of topics in these new special episodes. And at the end, I'll let you know how you can submit your questions for future editions of The People's Voice. Of course, thank you to the Grey History community for making all of this possible, and those members celebrating their membership anniversaries in April will be thanked personally at the end of this episode. And with that, let's begin. Our first question comes from True Revolutionary Sasha, and Sasha asks, "The revolutionaries were Roman history buffs, which I fully support. Were they aware of the Diocletian edict of price maximums? Was this used as a reference?" Well, yes, the revolutionaries were certainly Roman history buffs, but not when it came to Diocletian's price edicts. For context, Diocletian's reforms were issued around 301 AD and were part of a broader attempt to stabilize the Roman economy. The empire was suffering from rampant inflation, currency devaluation, social unrest, all the good stuff, and so the Romans issued an edict on price maximums, not too dissimilar from the French revolutionaries, and the Romans were attempting to set a legal maximum on the cost of goods and services across the empire. In terms of its scope, it's actually much larger than what the French did. The Romans itemized price ceilings over more than 1,000 goods and services, so it was a huge undertaking. And like the French, the basic idea here was to prevent profiteering and to maintain affordability. Also like the French, it didn't really work, and ultimately the Romans reversed these reforms. Now, as it relates to your question, the first discovery of a fragment of these edicts occurred in 1709 in modern-day Turkey. So some Europeans did know about Roman efforts to fix prices almost a century before the French Revolution. However, they did not know which emperor had issued the edict, and they didn't know the true scope and scale of the reforms. It's not until the 1820s that the debate over which emperor issued the edicts is largely put to bed. So, to answer part of your question, the revolutionaries were certainly not aware of Diocletian's price edicts because they didn't know they were Diocletian's. As it relates to what they knew about any sort of Roman price maximums, most of the fragments that we have were actually found in the 1800s. Given the relatively niche nature of the 1709 discovery, I doubt that many or even any members of the convention were aware of these fragments and thus these price maximums when they were legislating in 1793. Furthermore, if you go dig up the archives of the convention's debates for the days around the introduction of the price maximum in 1793, I can't see any references to such edicts from ancient Rome. Perhaps that's in part because the revolutionaries tended to more focus on the Roman Republic rather than the Roman Empire, but again, I can't see references to these specific edicts. References to ancient Rome in the week before and after are definitely common. So, short answer, no, I don't think in 1793 that the deputies were aware of what the Romans had done, and they certainly didn't know definitively that it was Diocletian behind them. And with that, thank you, Sasha, for your question, and thank you for supporting the show for the last 18 months. Now, the topic of price controls actually segues very nicely to our second question, which comes from True Revolutionary Andrew. And Andrew asks, I'd like to know more about how real the conspiratorial fears of the Committee of Public Safety were. Greedy merchants hoarding grain, for instance. Were these actual proven instances, or was this really the regime blame shedding? And why, in reality, was food still short? There surely can't have been bad harvests every year since the 1780s. And finally, did that shortage only affect Paris, other large cities, small towns, rural areas, etc.? So thank you, Andrew, for these questions, and let's begin with one of the favourite boogeymen of the sans-culotte movement, the infamous hoarders and speculators. Did greedy merchants exist? Yes, absolutely. There were people trying to profit from the crises of 1793. The convention was not just legislating against phantoms. These were real problems. In fact, people were executed for these crimes relating to hoarding and speculation. To be fair, there weren't many deaths. Specifically for the charge of withholding goods from the market, there were at least 8 sentenced on record. So they were rare, but they did happen. And I think you should note that the number of people arrested or investigated would likely be substantially higher, and in fact, it's more than possible that people who had been detained on suspicion of these crimes might have died in prison. But while there were profiteers and speculators and monopolists, these were not the principal factors driving up prices in 1793. Some revolutionaries certainly thought they were. They genuinely believed that this was the principal problem, but I don't think the evidence supports that at all. And with the benefit of hindsight, we can see a whole range of factors that are coming together to collectively drive up the cost of goods and result in insufficient supplies of both food and basic commodities. Probably the most important factor is the war. And the war creates food shortages in a variety of ways, some obvious, some not so much. Firstly, hundreds of thousands of men were being taken out of what was primarily an agricultural economy, as were hundreds of thousands of horses, combined with the requisition of oxen, carts, carriages, barges. The entire system of growing, harvesting, and transporting food is being robbed of not one, but many of its fundamental components. The entire food production system is experiencing shortages of the resources it needs to generate and distribute food. Secondly, some regions of France, even in normal times, had to import food. The south of France did not grow sufficient food for its domestic needs. Cities like Marseille and Toulon, they were dependent on food imports from abroad, notably Italy and Africa. Elsewhere, French sugar supplies, for example, they come from the Caribbean. So naval blockades and the disruption of foreign trade routes, they also have a huge impact on the distribution of food. And not only grain, but sugar, olive oil, a range of other foodstuffs. Thirdly, because armies are concentrated in specific locations, the presence of an additional 100,000 men creates regional supply shortages. If you think about it, cities like Bordeaux and Marseille, the third and fourth largest cities, they have populations of just over 100,000 people. They're roughly comparable in size. So imagine when armies that are easily half that size, even approaching that size, suddenly rock up in some town on the Belgian frontier. These are communities and regions that have not had to sustain such a large population or such a large number of mouths, and all of a sudden they need to supply food for the equivalent of an entire city. That's a very difficult task, particularly in wartime and on short notice. And so these are just some of the ways that the war alone is driving up food scarcity and impacting prices and perceptions of hoarding and speculation. Of course, war is not the only factor here. Economic policies are contributing as well. The continued issuance of the assignat or the revolution's paper currency, that's certainly not helpful. If the government is printing money, why would you want to exchange your goods for a piece of paper that is depreciating by the day? Especially when that same government is losing the war and that paper money has a very real risk of becoming worthless in a few months' time. Other economic policies had negative impacts as well, including price controls. I mean, peasants might deliberately conceal their produce if they deemed that the official price was too low or that it was set at an unfair level. And government records actually acknowledged this and acknowledged that there was a genuine problem in encouraging peasants to bring their goods to market. And so you had a situation where policies could incentivize the very behavior that they were trying to prevent. Finally, you mentioned bad weather. Yes, it's an important factor. The harvests weren't great, but it is not as big a problem compared to, say, the war. Earlier in the revolution, weather was one of the key factors. But now we've got so many issues in play that I wouldn't say that the problem is insufficient production. Instead, I would look at the impacts of distribution because of things like the war, but also the British-led blockades, not only impacting the domestic production and distribution, but also foreign imports. Finally, regarding the geographic distribution, I've touched on this in my answer, but it is fair to say that some regions do fare better than others. But broadly speaking, most large urban centres are having a miserable time. It's not just Paris. We saw in the Federalist revolts how food shortages were impacting Marseille and Toulon in mid-1793. These are in the south. They're historically dependent on imports. And indeed, other cities as well, Lyon and Bordeaux, these are trading economies. They're going through economic downturn as a result of the war, and that creates a different set of food affordability issues. If you think about how many silk workers are unemployed in Lyon, or how many commercial sailors and professionals in the trade industry are out of work in Bordeaux, it doesn't matter how expensive the food is when you have no income. It's still expensive. So, in summary, yes, there are instances of speculation and hoarding. These definitely happen. It's only natural for humans or a select group of humans to be acting in their economic self-interests. Sometimes there is this genuine profiteering and speculation. But in most cases, even in cases where peasants are withholding goods, this is about economic, rational self-interest. In the bigger picture, issues like war and the government's economic policies are more problematic than greedy merchants. That said, as you alluded to, speculators, monopolists, hoarders, they make a great scapegoat, and they're an easy punching bag for the regime and politicians of all stripes. And so you continually see them referenced in 1793 and 1794, and you can't underestimate the fact that there are many people, whether they be politicians or regular citizens, that genuinely believe that the key issue here is the actions of hoarders and speculators rather than these bigger factors like the war. So thank you, Andrew, for your question, and thank you for supporting the show for the last 16 months. Our next question comes from the virtuous citizen Timothy, and Timothy asks, given the low levels of impartial and systematic accountability at the time, it must be safe to assume that a proportion of the arrests and executions of the terror were really the personal settling of private scores. For example, I want to buy your land, or you cheated on me. Petty stuff. What evidence do we have of this going on? Was it widespread? Or was it really all politically motivated dispatching of rivals and chasing conspiratorial wins? So, were there a proportion of arrests and executions motivated in part by personal grievances? Yes, I'm sure there were. You just think of what we saw in the Federalist revolts, particularly after the reoccupation of some of those cities. You had liberated Jacobins essentially just sitting there and able to point out and identify traitors as they pleased. Were some of those selected, chosen because of perceived wrongs or insults or other vendettas? I find it hard to believe that that wasn't the case, at least in some instances. But if I put aside my lack of faith in humanity and actually focus on the evidence, it paints an intriguing and complicated picture. The first thing I would say is that every citizen, whether they were involved in the institutions of government and surveillance or not, they were expected to behave in a virtuous manner. They were expected to be disinterested in personal gain, selfless, interested only in the public good. And this means that you absolutely did not want to be making accusations which may backfire. You do not want to be seen as wielding the terror for your own personal gain. And so given the fact that people are incentivized to suppress any hint that personal grievances might be influencing a trial or an execution, finding the evidence that demonstrates such motivations is difficult because people or contemporaries at the time are incentivized to destroy and suppress that evidence. That said, we do have some interesting examples where it may be happening, as well as other examples where self-interest and personal advantage is definitely motivating one's behavior. We also have examples of the kind of rumors and hearsay that the authorities were dealing with, which made their job of impartial and fair justice really difficult. And so I want to go through some of those examples to help paint the picture of what the surveillance institutions are trying to grapple with. So let's start with an example where denunciations were probably motivated for dubious reasons. One aspect of the Revolutionary War, which is common across all frontiers, was tensions between the military and the local civilian populations. And I'm not talking about foreign populations in occupied lands, I'm talking about French communities. If you think about it, armies were competing with locals for food, for resources, for housing, and the presence of the armed forces could be a real imposition on small communities. And friction was a natural result. There are tons of examples of this. For example, in one alpine town, the local military camp keeps cutting trees down from the town's woods. And this is problematic for two reasons. Firstly, the soldiers were using a finite resource that the community also needed to use. But more importantly, the wood's location had actually been deliberately cultivated in part to shield the town from the risk of avalanches. And so soldiers were not only taking away a key resource, which was used for firewood and housing and the like, but they were taking away the town's defense as well. And this is a more unusual example, but one of the many ways where tensions could really flare up between the military and civilian authorities and civilian populations. More common examples revolve around food. Historian Alan Forrest notes that, due to insufficient food supply, soldiers would occasionally accuse townsfolk of hoarding and speculation. Peasants and shopkeepers would be accused of trying to cheat the soldiers out of their rations, of selling inferior goods, of inflating prices, and the result was often denunciations to the local surveillance committees. Is this an example of personal grievances fueling accusations? I think so. I think it could be. I think you could make that case. No doubt sometimes there were genuine issues here. I mean, shopkeepers and peasants legally had to accept assignats, the paper currency, and I have no doubt that sometimes they refused to do so. Also, the practice of two prices, one for paper currency and one for coin, that was illegal in late 1793, but again, I'm sure it continued to happen in some instances. So, were these denunciations valid? In some senses, yes, but were they also in part motivated due to private score settling? Well, I think you could make the case for that as well. Elsewhere, you can see examples where revolutionary authorities really aren't sure what to do with certain accusations, particularly when they are the very definition of rumour. In one instance, the following claim got to the local surveillance committee, and as I read the following quote, I want you to imagine that you're a member of the surveillance committee and ponder what you would make of the assertion that's presented. So this is an accusation that was brought before a surveillance committee in one commune. Mathieu said that Pierre had told him that citizen Rougier had said to her spouse that the old Suzak had said in Rougier's shop, "Please to God that the convention is overthrown." Now, what is one meant to do with an accusation like that? You can see the difficulties for impartial justice here and the ease in which a rumour could be used as a weapon, but also how easily it could balloon and get out of control. But to wrap up this question, we do actually have some really concrete examples of people using denunciations and accusations for their own self-interest and personal gain. We have an instance of a prison informer, for example, who would denounce his fellow prisoners in the hope of receiving some form of clemency. And actually, his testimony from this prison informant was key for the execution of more than 50 people on very flimsy evidence, including some related to a potential assassination attempt against Robespierre. And just to reiterate, this prison informant is essentially fabricating evidence in the hope that his false testimony will result in personal benefit. So, in short, did personal score settling and self-interest corrupt the judicial process? Yes. Was it widespread? I don't think so, but it's difficult to quantify the problem. Again, if you were suspected of corrupting the legal process for your own advantage, that would be a prompt one-way ticket to the guillotine. But that said, we do have isolated incidents where it definitely occurs, and as in the case of the soldiers, for example, we can reasonably suspect that some accusations were not always the most impartial and devoid of emotion. And in the future, we're actually going to see this in the politicians' terror, where there are all sorts of denunciations and accusations, yes, sometimes due to political disagreements, but also in part fueled by a desire to seek personal advantage or even safety from being accused themselves. So thank you, Timothy, for your question, and thank you for your support for the last 16 months. Our final question for this episode of The People's Voice comes from the virtuous citizen Brit. The nobility in pre-revolutionary France are known for living luxuriously and absorbing wealth through feudal rights. But I was wondering, what kind of political power did dukes, for example, actually have in their duchies? Could a duke create policies and legislation for his duchy? Was the title mostly honorary, or did some dukes actually create laws, assign mayors, and exert general political authority over the regions they ruled? Could a duke create policies for his duchy that might be in conflict with the wishes of the absolute monarch? In short, what governmental and legislative powers did the high nobility actually possess if they chose to use them? Well, this is a fantastic question, Britt, and it's nice to head back to before 1789 in what seems almost an eternity ago. Now, the political power of the high nobility in pre-revolutionary France was complex and by no means uniform, but I can give you an answer at a high level. By the late 18th century, the French monarchy had progressively reduced the independent authority of the nobility. They were certainly not the quasi-sovereigns that still existed across the border in the Holy Roman Empire. Louis XIII and Louis XIV had spent a great deal of effort trying to subdue rebellious vassals and convert them into courtiers. And this, in some ways, is just one element of the greater centralization efforts that you see in the 17th and 18th century in France. By the time of the Revolution, the nobility did not have the ability to create policies or legislate that conflicted with royal decrees. The king's law was paramount. The nobility as an estate did have some mechanisms to resist laws, Notably, the parlements could resist royal legislation, but this wasn't a power that belonged to individual dukes, for example. That said, nobles could still exert considerable influence over their domains, particularly as it related to justice. Things like adjudicating disputes regarding feudal rights and obligations, that was very much influenced by the higher nobility. And in fact, some had the right to appoint judges to lower courts, so they could certainly shape the implementation of some laws, particularly as it related to feudal rights. Another factor here is just old school patronage. Nobles could pull all sorts of strings to get their people into government positions, into schools and academies, the church, etc. And so there is a power dynamic here. It certainly is well short of crafting legislation for their duchy, but if regional officials owe you their job, you'll be able to influence decisions and policies to a certain extent. As it relates to the appointment of mayors, it wouldn't surprise me if some higher nobles could shape the composition of their local municipality, not just the mayors, but maybe town councillors and the like. However, I haven't found any concrete example of this occurring, and I certainly don't have any indication that this was widespread. Certainly, the practices of local governments could change dramatically from town to town, region to region, but I don't have any reason to believe that dukes selecting mayors or the like was the norm. You have to remember that often town councils, they were composed of aristocratic families and bourgeois families that might have been involved in local government for a very long period of time. They were often very jealous of their prerogatives and powers and position, and many of them did not serve at the pleasure of a single local lord. So were nobles involved in the process or dukes involved in the process? Quite possibly. They might be able to actually sit on these municipal councils as well if they so chose and they weren't partying in Versailles. But I don't have any indication that this was a widespread prerogative that they enjoyed. So, in short, the nobles didn't have a tremendous amount of power. Royal power was the big game in town. That's why powerful families spent a lot of time at Versailles trying to befriend and influence the king and to an extent his ministers. And that's partially why the nobility were also so keen to summon the Estates General in the late 18th century. The Estates General was going to be their ticket back to power because they thought that the nobility, through controlling the votes of both the First Estate and the Second Estate, would be able to control the entire body. Of course, it didn't turn out like that, but hindsight's a wonderful thing. So yes, the nobles did have some power, particularly as it related to judicial matters concerning feudal obligations and the like, but they were no longer minor princes or quasi-sovereigns. The real power sat with the king alone. Even the parlements, Louis XV famously suppressed the parlements for trying to block his legislation. And he succeeded. He largely succeeded. Louis XVI brought them back, and some historians would consider this absolutely needless. It was Louis shooting himself in the foot as he did so. And I suppose the moral of the story there is that popularity isn't everything. Anyway, thank you, Britt, for your question, and thank you for supporting the show over the last 12 months. That brings an end to this episode of The People's Voice. If you would like to submit a question for future editions, please just leave a comment on Patreon under this episode or drop a message in the community chat room on Discord. Of course, if you're not part of the fantastic Grey History community, please support the show for a coffee or two a month. I could really use your support in keeping Grey History on the air, and there's plenty of perks to enjoy while sponsoring history that isn't black and white. From hours of amazing bonus content to ad-free listening, indulge in all the benefits of joining the revolution. Please support the show today at patreon.com. This month, we celebrate the membership anniversary of our fellow revolutionaries. A tremendous thank you to everyone who joined the revolution during April in previous years. 4 years. George H., Michael W., and Russell J. 3 years, James T. 2 years, Adam L., Sophia S., Jeff R., Carl B., Alan G., Danielle F., and John P. 1 year, Hilberto M., Pablo T., Ronnie R., Brooke M., Bex, Gregory A.R., Britt C., Lata, Louise I., Liz, and Binaroid. Thank you to the entire Grey History community for making all of this possible.